Hello, you're very welcome to this Wheels for Wellbeing webinar series that we've produced to accompany the 5th edition of our Guide to Inclusive Cycling. My name's Kay Inkle, I'm Campaigns and Policy Manager, and I'll be delivering this first webinar with you. The second two in the series will be delivered by my colleagues from the Campaigns and Policy team. Before we go any further, it's really important for us to give our thanks to the Rhys Jeffries Road Fund, who supported the development of the 5th edition of the Guide to Inclusive Cycling and this webinar series. That said, we should also highlight that any errors or omissions within this webinar or the Guide to Inclusive Cycling are our responsibility at Wheels for Wellbeing. We should also point out that the contents of the guide and the webinar do not necessarily reflect the views of the Rhys Jeffries Road Fund, but are very much Wheels for Wellbeing's content. Thank you. So, with that disclaimer done, let's look at what the outline of this webinar series and today's webinar is going to be. So there are 3 webinars in the series that are intended to give some essential information from the Guide to Inclusive Cycling. The first one that I'll be delivering with you today includes everything that you need to know to have a foundational understanding about disabled people and cycling. The second webinar in the series focuses in on infrastructure and looks at the ways that infrastructure in the environment can be both a barrier or an enabler to inclusive cycling. And the third webinar in the series looks at micromobilities, the growth of shared forms of low carbon transport and their impact for disabled people. In the webinar today, we're going to have a look at what we know about cycles and cyclists. We're going to explore some data about disabled people cycling, the types of cycles they use and the journeys they make. We're going to try and understand how cycles function as essential mobility aids. And then we're going to look at some of the barriers to cycling for disabled people, which are not the infrastructure barriers, which are covered in webinar 2. To warm us up, we're going to have a quick quiz called Name That Cycle. So on the screen, you should be able to see a variety of different types of cycle. And what I want you to do is to take a couple of minutes to see how many of those you can name. If visual images are not accessible to you, you can also do the Name That Cycle quiz by thinking about how many different styles and configurations of cycle there might be. So how many wheels, how many people do they carry, what's the configuration of the wheels, what are the purposes of the different types of cycle. So see how many different types of cycle you can think of in that way. And then we'll come back when you've had a couple of minutes and see how you get on with that. Okay, hopefully you've had time to have a bit of a think. If you want a little bit longer, then do pause the webinar to make sure you've had plenty of time to have a look or a think about the types of cycles that might be available. The next slide gives you the names of many of those types of cycle that are on the screen. So the easiest ones for people to identify are the standard 2-wheel bikes or bicycles. There's 3 different types on the screen. There's a racing bike, there's a mountain bike, and there's an electric bike. The other types of cycles on the screen include tricycles. So these are 3-wheeled cycles, and these can be upright, so a seated position very similar to a traditional bicycle, or they can be recumbent, where you cycle in a more reclined position. Tricycles can also have different configurations of the wheels. So sometimes there's 1 wheel at the front and 2 at the back, and that's called a delta tricycle. And then there are tricycles that have 2 wheels at the front and 1 at the back, and that's called a tadpole because it's more or less the same shape as a tadpole. But there's also lots of variations of tricycles as well, which you might be able to see on the screen. So you can have a tricycle that's a tandem that carries 2 people. You can have a tricycle that's a cargo cycle, and so that has a box on the front. There are also tricycles that have a seat on the front for a passenger, and cargo cycles that are made with a platform so they can carry a wheelchair user on the front of them. Some tricycles can also be pedalled by the hands, and these are called hand cycles. And again, these can be recumbent or upright in style. The other types of cycles on the screen are, as we've already mentioned in terms of the tricycle, are tandems. And these are cycles that are designed to carry more than one person who is pedaling. So the other types of people carrying a cycle that we've mentioned, the person is a passenger. If it's a tandem, then the person is actively pedaling. And in addition to the tricycle tandem, we've got the more traditional inline two-wheel tandem, and we've also got a side-by-side tandem which has four wheels and two seats seated side by side. So from that quick overview, you can see there's a huge range of different types of cycles, and they can carry one or more people, and they come in all kinds of different numbers of wheels, seating positions, and means of pedaling. Having thought about all those different types of cycles, if I was to ask you which was the first cycle to be invented out of all of those that we've just talked about, which might you think it would be? And again, you can take a pause in the webinar if you want a minute to have a think about it, but no Googling. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to make your decision. The next slide shows that in fact the first ever cycle to be invented was the hand cycle. It was invented by a man called Stefan Farfler, we believe in around 1655. So that predates every other type of bicycle, including things like the penny farthing. On the screen, you can see a picture of Stefan in his hand cycle. It's made of wood. It has two wheels at the back and a very big wooden chair. And then at the front, there is one wheel with a box over it, and then two hand pedals, one on each side of the box, which propel by turning the front wheel. So when we look at this, one thing that is really interesting to note is that actually cycling was invented by a disabled person, and a lot earlier than we often think of the invention of cycling. So if we're thinking about how we refer to cycles, this actually means that bikes or bicycles are adapted hand cycles. So the hand cycle was the original. So you might have already noticed during this webinar that I'm using language about cycles and cycling in a very specific way. And we do this in order to be both accurate and inclusive. So when we use the term bike or bicycle, our preferred terms for that will be a standard cycle. And that refers to the regular two-wheel bike that most people imagine when they think about cycling. For all other types of cycle, we refer to them as non-standard cycles. And this includes cycle types that have been designed specifically for use by disabled people, such as hand cycles. And it also includes cycles that are not two-wheel bikes, but may not be specifically designed for disabled people, although some disabled people might use them. So, for example, a tandem or a cargo cycle. We would never use the term adapted or adaptive cycles to refer to something like a hand cycle or a tandem or a trike, because adapted means something different to a non-standard cycle. So when we talk about a cycle being adapted, that means that some bespoke alteration has been made to it to make it more accessible. So that can be very simple things such as just raising or lowering the height of the saddle, or it might be something a bit more complicated like adding e-assist to the gear changes, like wiring both brakes to one lever on one side, or it might be something about changing the pedals perhaps. So that is what adaptations mean. It doesn't mean that it's just a different configuration to a bicycle. We would also never use terms like special bikes or disabled bikes. When we're talking about cycling in general, we would just use the term cycles because that includes all types of cycles, both standard and non-standard cycles. And it's also really important to note that disabled people ride all different types of cycle, everything from standard two-wheel bicycles to things that are more unusual, like perhaps a side-by-side hand cycle tandem. So now we've had a bit of an overview of some of the different cycle types that exist and the language that we use about cycling. Let's have a look in a bit more detail about the types of cycles that disabled people use, and specifically here the types of cycles that disabled people own. So the data on the screen that I'm going to talk through is based on a Wheels for Wellbeing survey that we carried out in 2021 and which we published in 2022. It's important to note that although this is a nationwide survey, it's not representative of all disabled people. And in fact, there isn't any robust national data that exists about disabled people and cycling. However, Wheels for Wellbeing fairly regularly survey disabled cyclists, and although the findings are only indicative, they do show some consistent themes and patterns that are important for our understanding. So this survey is based on 245 self-selecting respondents. One of the questions asked the respondents about the type of cycle that they owned. Some respondents owned more than one cycle, but what the results showed was that 60% owned a standard two-wheel bicycle, 26% owned a trike, including upright and recumbent versions, 17% owned a hand cycle, and that might be a one-piece or a clip-on cycle, 9% owned a tandem, and 5% owned a cargo cycle, and that could be a freight or a people carrying cycle. So these are perhaps surprising figures in terms of the proportion of disabled people who own or were using a standard two-wheel bicycle. However, that's perhaps not too surprising when we consider that standard two-wheel bicycles are the most commonly available type of cycle. They're the cheapest to buy. There's a very robust second-hand market. They're also easiest to park and store and to use current infrastructure with. So in that way, it's not surprising perhaps that if you're a disabled person who can cycle, then you are likely to be someone who owns a standard two-wheel bicycle because that is the most easily accessible and which works within current infrastructure. If we look in a bit more detail at our survey respondents, we can see that 87% of them, so the vast majority, own their own cycle. So again, that possibly makes them a little bit of an unusual group in terms of disabled people and access to cycling. We also asked questions to see how often disabled people cycle once they had either their own cycle or access to a cycle. More than 3/4, so 77% of them, cycled once a week or more, and 36% cycled on a daily basis. So we can see that once disabled people have access to a suitable cycle, cycling becomes something that is very significant in terms of the frequency that disabled people undertake it. So it becomes a very important part of disabled people's physical activity, mobility, and transport. We also asked some other questions around what makes cycling accessible for disabled people. Nearly a third of the respondents, so 31%, said that their cycle had e-assist. E-assist is really important for disabled people. It enables disabled people to travel further and faster and over more challenging terrain than they would be able to without e-assist. It's particularly important for disabled people with particular impairment types that might affect their cardiovascular or musculoskeletal strength. And it's also really important for some cycle types like hand cycles, because obviously the arms are not as strong for carrying the full body weight as legs are. So eAssist enables disabled people to make those essential journeys. It enables disabled people to travel further, and it also enables disabled people to travel at a safe speed, particularly when using on-road infrastructure and needing to navigate junctions and roundabouts where without eAssist, disabled people would not be moving at a safe enough speed to interact with traffic. So eAssist is a very important accessibility feature. One of the other features that disabled people told us was really important in the accessibility of their cycle was the capacity to fold it. So this is really important in terms of accessing public transport to make multimodal journeys, and also in terms of storage both at the home and location as well as on public transport. The eAssist and folding combination together really enhances accessibility of cycling. And on the screen, there are two images of folding eAssist cycles. On the right hand side is a picture of a Jorvik tricycle, which is the Delta type of tricycle. So one small wheel at the front, two small wheels at the back, and there is a small luggage carrying basket over those wheels, and below the saddle is the mount for the battery. This cycle also folds, so makes it very convenient for accessing those smaller spaces. The other cycle pictured on the screen is an eAssist Brompton. So it's the standard two-wheel bicycle in the Brompton design, but it has a battery mount just over the front of the front wheel below the handlebars. And this cycle also folds for easy storage or manoeuvring. So eAssist and folding cycles make cycling much more accessible for disabled people. So we can see from this data that once disabled people have a cycle that's accessible to them, then they use it on a very regular basis. But it goes beyond just using cycling as a regular form of transport or physical activity. So for many disabled people, cycling isn't just a leisure activity or a form of physical activity, both of which are very important, but cycling also provides essential mobility for disabled people who might not have any other option to make that journey. So in our survey, we asked disabled cyclists which they find easier, cycling or walking. Nearly 2/3 report that cycling is easier than walking, that's 64%, and less than 10%, so less than 1/10, find walking easier than cycling. Just over a quarter find walking and cycling equally difficult. But what's really important about this is for many disabled people, using a cycle, and very often a standard two-wheeled bicycle, is much easier than walking and allows disabled people to travel further, to travel faster, to travel in a pain-free and efficient manner that they don't have any other means to do. And we always reference this in relation to the research done by Disabled Ramblers, who, on analysing a range of different data sources, found that 90% of mobility impaired disabled people don't have a suitable mobility aid to complete a 1 kilometre journey. So 1 kilometre, that's obviously not only access to all your essential local amenities such as shops, post office, GP, but that's also access to your public transit stop. So the bus stop, the train station, the tram stop, and many disabled people who are mobility impaired don't have a way of doing that. But for very many, cycling can fill that gap, even a standard two-wheel bicycle. So we have two quotes on the screen from our survey respondents expressing how essential cycling is for their mobility. The first one says, "I have spinal issues and can't walk any real distance. but I cycle on a normal bike without a problem. It gives me my independence. Another person said, I have had MS for 30 years and I wish I had realised earlier that I could cycle much better than I could walk. So, cycling can be a really powerful intervention for disabled people with limited mobility. But when disabled people are not permitted to cycle, then they lose all of that mobility. So, no cycle equals no mobility. So, in recognition of the fact that for many disabled people, cycling provides that essential mobility, one of the pieces of work that Wheels for Wellbeing have been undertaking for many years is to try and have cycles recognised as mobility aids. And although this doesn't exist in current national legislation, at a local level, we have seen some really positive moves in this direction. So on the screen, there are 3 pictures that are taken at Wandsworth Bridge in London. And these pictures were taken during some works to strengthen Wandsworth Bridge, which meant it was closed to motor traffic and just as a fairly narrow pedestrian path was left. So pedestrians could cross, but no motor vehicles. The original plan for while the works were carried out was to insist that all cyclists dismount and walk across the bridge. However, we got in touch with Wandsworth and the company carrying out the works and pointed out that many disabled people who are using cycles will not be able to dismount and push their cycles over the bridge. So could they revise that cyclists must dismount to cyclists dismount unless their cycle is a mobility aid? And one of the pictures on the screen shows that they did indeed take us up on that request. They made a sign for the bridge so it's black writing on yellow that says cyclists dismount unless a mobility aid. We provided some resources for the security staff who would be monitoring the use of the bridge to make sure they understood that some people might need to remain on their cycles and how to approach them in a way that wasn't challenging people's right to move as disabled people. And we also supported with some public information and comms. And we found that to be really effective, and we trialled that ourselves. There's a link on the screen that will take you to some more details about that campaign. But since then, we've also had that same sign used in other places during other works or other situations where cyclists are being asked to dismount. So really starting to recognise that yes, some cyclists are disabled people. They can't dismount and push their cycle in the same way that you can't dismount and push your wheelchair or your mobility scooter. So those disabled people should be allowed to continue in that space using their cycle at safe pedestrian speed. So that's a little bit about some of the data that we have about disabled cyclists, some of how important that we know cycling is for disabled people's journeys, and also how we want to make cycling more accessible for disabled people. It's also worth reiterating some of the wider impacts of cycling for disabled people. So, as we've already understood, cycling can be an essential form of transport and mobility for disabled people, and for many replaces walking where walking is difficult or impossible. But of course, cycling also provides access to social contact and social participation. It's a form of physical exercise and activity. It provides access to nature and green spaces. It also provides autonomy in that it's one of the very few ways that disabled people can make journeys without having the involvement or barriers imposed by other people, such as requiring the driver to lower the ramp onto a bus or having to book assistance to travel on the train. So it provides that level of autonomy that can be quite rare in terms of other forms of transport. Cycling is also fun. I think for those of us who are cyclists, we know there is nothing like the joy of moving along through the power of your own body, feeling the wind in your hair, or the snow or the rain on your face, whatever the weather conditions might be. But there is something really joyful about mobilizing in that physical way. And all of these things, that joy, autonomy, accessing nature and green spaces, physical activity, and social contact, we know these are essential for good physical and mental health. So, cycling can have so many positive benefits for disabled people. On the screen, there is a photograph from a nature ride that was led by Wheels for Wellbeing, where people using some of our non-standard cycles were taken out on a led ride through London, which was also led by a botanist who was pointing out some of the really interesting aspects of the local environment and what to look out for in terms of interesting natural features. So combining so many of those things, that social contact, the physical activity, the access to nature and green space. Many of the respondents in our survey specifically talk about the mental health and wellbeing impacts of cycling for them. A couple of quotes from those participants are on the screen. So one of them said, "Being a disabled person who can get out and cycle has been a lifesaver for me. When cycling, I feel less disabled. It's the best treatment for my mental health." Another person said, "I find it hugely enabling to cycle around for transport and my commute. It keeps me active and mobile. It prevents degenerative decline in my muscles and makes me feel good about myself." And the photograph on the screen shows someone cycling along in the rain wearing a waterproof high vis. They're riding a red semi-recumbent tricycle and they're using a protected piece of cycle infrastructure. So there's a cycle lane on a road, it has a painted white line and some bollards, and just behind in the road, not in the cycle space fortunately, you can see the front of a red bus. Cycling can also have really important mental health impacts when someone becomes disabled following a life-changing injury. So some research that I carried out with disabled cyclists that was published in 2020 also explored the issue of mental health. And one of the respondents who had become disabled as an adult talked about how cycling impacted on the recovery from the injury that would cause their disability. So they said, "To my mind, you can go one of two ways if you've had an accident. Obviously, for people who are already disabled, they have grown up with that. But when something happens to you like this, you can go one of two ways. You can sit in a chair and go, oh my goodness, this is terrible. What am I going to do? Or you can try and get on with life. And I think if you can stay positive and do what you could do before, i.e. before the injury, then that certainly helps. I think if I hadn't had that, e.g. cycling, that would have been a very different story for me." So this person really emphasising how the fact that they continue to cycle after becoming an amputee really helped their recovery from that life-changing experience. So the fact that they were cycling again, they were able to do those things again, and of course having the health benefits of physical activity had a huge impact on their mental health. If you want to hear some more disabled people's stories about their experiences of cycling, and particularly how cycling is essential for their mobility, you can sign up to our My Cycle, My Mobility Aid podcast. There is a link and a QR code on the screen, and you will hear lots of different stories in the words of disabled people themselves as they discuss their experiences of cycling and its impact on them. Okay, so it's time for you to do a bit of thinking. So as before, if you want to take a couple of minutes to pause the webinar and think about this question, then please do so. The question I'm going to get you to think about is, what do you think are the most significant barriers to cycling that are reported by disabled cyclists. So this is disabled people who are already cycling. What do you think can make it difficult for them to cycle, or perhaps stop them cycling altogether? The question is on the screen, and below that is a replica of the hand cycle that was made by Stefan Fafler in 1655. So it's been made more recently than that, but it's made of wood. And again, it's just a reminder that the first ever cycle was made and invented by a disabled person. Okay, so hopefully you've had time to have a think about that. And the next slide is a graphic that shows the results from our survey where we asked disabled cyclists what were the most significant barriers to cycling for them. People could name more than one barrier, so this is why the figures don't add up to 100%. So when asked what made cycling most difficult or impossible, 53% of respondents mentioned infrastructure, 35% said parking or storage for their cycle was a barrier. 33% mentioned the cost of non-standard cycles or adaptations to cycle. 30% mentioned being unable to hire or loan a cycle that was suitable for them. Nearly a quarter, 24%, said that public hostility or harassment or abuse was a deterrent to cycling. And 23% talked about the lack of opportunities to try out cycling in their area so they could figure out what kind of cycle worked for them. So webinar 2 in this series is going to focus on infrastructure in detail, talking about both on and off-road infrastructure and parking and storage. So in this webinar, I'm going to talk about some of those barriers that are not infrastructure related. So after the infrastructure and parking and storage barrier, the next barrier that was most frequent that disabled people mentioned was the cost of non-standard cycles or adaptations to cycles, which were highlighted by a third or 33% of respondents. One of them said, "The absolute biggest barrier to any disabled person who wants to cycle are the extortionate prices of the gear." On the screen, I have an example to illustrate the cost of non-standard cycles for disabled people. And again, this is purely illustrative, and I could have picked one of many examples. So on the screen is a picture of a Quickie Attitude hybrid hand bike. So this is a hand cycle that attaches to a wheelchair. It has e-assist, which, as we've already noted, is a really essential accessibility feature of cycling for disabled people. When I took this example, the retail price of this add-on e-assist hand cycle was £5,995, not including VAT. So that's just under £6,000. But it's also really important to note that to be able to use a hand cycle like that, you will also need an active rigid frame wheelchair, which you're looking at, again, a cost of at least £2,500 to £3,000. So that adds up to, we're looking at around £8,000 starting price. And there is a whole array of, really wonderful cycles available for disabled people, but they do have a very high price tag on them. The price of cycles is almost a double deterrent for disabled people, given that we know that there is also a disability pay and employment gap. So disabled people are less likely to be in paid employment, and they are more likely to be in lower pay than non-disabled people. And Scope and the TUC publish annual figures around both the disability pay and employment gap. So if you want to check out what the most up-to-date figure is, have a look at both of their websites. We also know that because of what is called the extra costs of being disabled, So the fact that when you're a disabled person, you need to pay for additional equipment, additional services, the fact that public transport might not be accessible, so you have to use taxis and so on, means that there is a price tag on disability, which, coupled with the pay and employment gaps, means that disabled people are more likely to live in poverty than non-disabled people. And again, Scope publishes annual figures on the disability price tag. So cost then is a real barrier. The people who have least access to income, so disabled people, face the highest financial cost to cycling. So this is a really significant barrier. The issue of cost relates. So one way to overcome the cost barrier to cycling is to borrow or hire a cycle, perhaps for a journey, for part of a day, maybe for a holiday or a period of a week or a month or longer. However, the lack of opportunity to use a share or hire scheme was a barrier for 31% of our respondents. So there's a graphic on the screen which highlights, as I've already mentioned, that the majority of our respondents already own their own cycle. But then for those who didn't, the type of cycle that they needed, maybe the cycle type or needing special adaptations, were not available on any of the share or hire schemes that were available in the country. So the pictures on the slides show the standard bike or e-bike share schemes, which do offer standard two-wheel bicycles, as well as e-scooter hire, which again only provides a standing two-wheel vehicle. Neither type of vehicle are particularly accessible for many disabled people. So the lack of non-standard cycles or adaptations to cycles available on these low-cost share and hire schemes made a significant barrier for disabled people. One of our respondents highlighted that they would like to hire a good upright touring tricycle when on holiday, but I have never found any trike hire. So the lack of share and hire options mean that disabled people are again doubly disadvantaged. Disabled people could most benefit from low-cost access to cycling, but are excluded because of the lack of accessible cycles that are available. However, one of the pieces of work that Wheels to Wellbeing have been doing is exploring how hire and share of non-standard cycles, with adaptations where needed, might work in practice. So we have a scheme called Wheels for Me London, which is funded by the Motability Foundation and which is exploring how to make cycle share of non-standard cycles accessible for disabled people in London. There are other pilot schemes running around the country funded by the Motability Foundation, looking at similar schemes in different parts of the country. And we're really hoping that the learning from these schemes can be built to create a national picture to inform local authorities and providers of cycles for hire and share schemes in different regions of what needs to be done to make sure there is provision for disabled people in those areas so they also have access to low-cost cycle hire and share schemes, and also what the logistics of making accessible hire and share schemes work might be. You're going to learn a bit more about the logistics and the principles behind shared mobility for disabled people in the third webinar in this series on micromobilities. If you want to learn a little bit more about the Wheels for Me London scheme, there is both a link to the scheme and the QR code to take you straight there on this slide. The final barrier, which wasn't related to infrastructure that disabled people mentioned in our survey, was what we might broadly call attitudinal barriers, but which are directly experienced as hostility and abuse. And this was reported by nearly a quarter or 24% of our respondents. So people talked about the kind of public comments, the public hostility or the public harassment that disabled people experienced when cycling, particularly when they were using a non-standard cycle or they were visibly disabled. So one person said, "The public's response to my non-standard cycle is appalling." One of the things that respondents noted was that actually the levels of hostility became worse during the lockdown and during the pandemic. We also know that there were increases in hostility towards disabled people during this time. So a couple of examples from that specific time that people talked about. One person said, "I have been shocked at the aggression of the public towards me using a hand cycle during lockdown. I've been with several confrontations over disabled people being clinically extremely vulnerable, as if we shouldn't be outside." Another person said, "I'm struggling to go out due to comments and abuse shouted at me, even though the traffic was much less during COVID." And this last comment really highlights that, well, the roads became much safer for cycling for many people because of the reduced amount of traffic. The public hostility became an increasing barrier at that time. And I think that attitudes towards disabled people is not something that gets talked about enough in terms of the impediments to disabled people taking up active travel. And yet it is something that a high proportion of disabled people that experience. So the Walk Will Cycle Trust, formerly Sustrans, did a survey in 2022 and they reported that only 57% of disabled people felt safe and welcome in their local area. And that's in the area where they live and work and regularly move around. So think about if that's where you live and you don't feel safe and welcome, how much worse it must be when you're travelling in unknown areas. So there remains this public attitude problem towards disabled people that is part of a cultural problem that we think needs more attention and to be redressed. So we're coming to the end of this webinar now. We've covered quite a wide range of ground. And so here's just a brief summary of some of the key points that I hope you've taken from this webinar. Firstly, that many disabled people can cycle and that cycling is often easier than walking for disabled people and is an essential form of mobility. Disabled people use all different types of cycles, including standard two-wheel bicycles, and cycling was invented by a disabled person, the first cycle being a hand cycle. Cycling has many benefits for disabled people, including essential transport and mobility, but disabled people face many barriers to cycling. The barriers include the cost of cycles, the lack of hire and share opportunities, and public attitudes. And the next two webinars are going to pick up on some of those topics in more detail. So webinar number 2 is going to look at infrastructure barriers and enablers to cycling, and webinar number 3 is going to explore micromobilities and shared mobilities in more detail. Don't forget these webinars are all based on the 5th edition of the Guide to Inclusive Cycling. An image of the cover of the Guide to Inclusive Cycling and a QR code to take you to the download page is on the screen now. The guide is free to download and use and is available in a range of formats. Thank you so much for listening to this webinar today. I really hope you found it useful. If you want to have a look for more of our resources in addition to the guide, there's a link and a QR code to our resources page. And you can also get in touch if you're interested in learning more about our training and consultancy services. Thank you again so much for your attention, and please do check out the next 2 webinars in the series. Thank you.